A mixture of deep, groaning, and musical alien sounds filled the pub. Each patron's face was a study in colors and shapes, and the music was peculiar. Behind the counter, a tall figure went among tables in the long, battered counter, everyone engrossed in their own tales and beverages. Lean and steady, the barman served drinks, cleaned up spills and passed by undetected, a human being among aliens merely a fixture in the body. He worked quietly every day, responding to inquiries with brief nods or head tilts. His motions were fluid, effective and consistently accurate. He was able to pull up a drink order without getting thrashed. Customers remarked that he appeared almost unnatural in his composure and kept the bar immaculate without losing a beat, although since he was only a barman and a human, no one gave him any attention. He appeared normal on his journey to the galaxy's edge to perform routine tasks, with the possible exception of his thin scars that appeared on his hands and the way his gaze darted around the bar. Taking in every aspect, guards stood in pairs, large and well-armed, and announced their presence with heavy footsteps and gruff voices. They frequently visited this outpost to drink after work or to keep watch when they were assigned, although none of them never bothered to give the barman a second glance, believing him to be just another uninteresting and plain human. Unique in that they ignored the man who was drinking and laughed loudly, their voices booming above the bar noise. They poured their refills quietly, and the barman never responded when they laughed or made jokes. Occasionally make fun of his modest attire or the quiet manner in which he worked, but he just continued working, sliding drinks across the bar, without displaying any signs of discomfort or rage. He was a routine presence that blended in with the surroundings, keeping the shelves stocked and cleaning flawlessly, almost like a ghost, yet occasionally a customer would look at him. With a glimmer of interest, some saw that he was unique, that he had a quiet intensity that made him stand out from other people they encountered, but they ignored it right away since they were preoccupied with the sounds and the ultimately, why would a lone barman on a far-off outpost be anything more than what he seemed to be? He filled each glass as he went along, cleaning the counter without stuttering or diverting his hands. He had a manner of working with an almost inhuman smoothness despite his scars. Considering the demands of the customer, placing a drink down as they finished their glass or making room as soon as it was abandoned, nobody recognized him, and he made no offer to the regulars. Just the barman, with his gaze working, nothing more, nothing less occasionally, without care or interest. He moved to the door to observe calmly, his eyes keen. Dark observed everything, including the guards' raucous laughter and stomping boots as they entered. He observed the aliens arguing and laughing in space, whispering deals to each other. He heard every hand reaching for a pocket, every private glance, and nothing seemed to escape his even yet. He continued to blend in with the background of the pub when there was a quiet moment. Once at ease, he would stop and allow his eyes to wander, his face unreadable, as though his thoughts were far away, but the time would come and go as fast as it could. Occasionally, when he returned to his job, customers observed this distant glance, and it was forgotten almost as fast as it seemed, and he provided no evidence that he was anything more than an effective keeping to himself while performing his duties. The barman ignored the boisterous and brazen guards. Looked at him once in a while, but it was usually a casual, innocuous human glance. Feeble, they didn't suspect anything else, he was simply valuable to them. When they needed more drink otherwise, he didn't notice, and they continued with their business as usual, disregarding the silent person who filled their drinks and passed them like a shadow, yet in those. When he paused, there was a flicker of something in his eyes that suggested a past existence or a faraway memory. If someone had looked closely enough, they may have seen the hint of readiness hidden beneath layers of serenity. His posture or his eyes seemed to see right through everything, but nobody did. He wanted it that way, and the bar was filled with alien whispers. Customers spoke to one another about their eerie encounters with famous characters and wild adventures. It wasn't uncommon for stories to spread around here, particularly ones that seemed to get more detailed with each repetition. However, rumors of a renowned human warrior were circulating, and they caught everyone's interest, filled the spaces between clinking drinks and laughter as they drifted like smoke, reaching every area. Rumors told of a human warrior from long ago who had established himself on far-off battlefields. It was stated that this warrior moved the galaxies with his trail of reverence and fear. Like a ghost and battled with unparalleled accuracy that even the most resilient aliens dreaded. Some soldiers referred to him as a phantom who entered battlefields without being spotted. Others said he had fought in some of the battles, leaving destruction in his path before vanishing without a trace. bloodiest battles, always coming out on top, and always one step ahead of his. Gradually, the stories became more sinister, portraying him as a person who was feared and revered, who had disappeared as the narrative progressed. His descriptions became increasingly detailed. And he had mysteriously arrived on the scene. They claimed that once adversaries were within his line of sight, they had no chance, and that he didn't require armor or advanced. His strongest weapon was his skill alone, which some people said he could defeat. His bare hands allowed him to move so quickly that even the strongest aliens were unaware of what had occurred until it was ended. And they claimed that his reputation could prevent a fight before it started, since nobody wanted to deal with those who were warriors like him met swift and cruel ends behind the bar counter. The barman listened to the stories that filled the room without pausing, his face remaining unchanged, evoking awe-inspiring gasps and whispers, but he just nodded while pouring beverages, his face probably showing nothing but practically disconnected a fixture, and listened in the background without responding quite yet, if one upon closer inspection. A little spark of recognition appeared in his eyes, accompanied by a quiet comprehension. As fast as it seemed, he seemed to know these tales, as though he had witnessed the battles. Even while he said nothing, the specifics increased with each recounting. Some patrons who added their own decorations spoke of the warrior's purportedly dark, sleek, and others depicted his combat style as nearly impenetrable, saying he moved like a shadow. The story suggested that this warrior was more than just a human. He was a sleek, lethal force that was unstoppable. Skills that were above the capabilities of regular men. None knew what had happened to him. Some claimed he had been arrested, while some thought he had just vanished, vanishing from the cosmos like a whisper on the wind. I heard an alien patron lean in close and speak in a low, respectful manner. The monster was enormous and covered in scales. He once killed a whole squadron by himself, whispering his eyes. They claim he didn't even break his bare hands wide and without a weapon. Others nodded and added their own details, their voices a mixture of terror and perspiration. With appreciation throughout it all, the barman worked quietly, practicing his moves and keeping his hands firm. Listened to the stories as if he were hearing them for the first time, but he had a knowing glance in his eyes that appeared to comprehend more than he revealed, but nobody gave him much attention because they were too engrossed in the tale. In a galaxy filled of unusual animals, he was just another human, another uninteresting face to them. Quipped that a fighter of that caliber may be anywhere, concealed in plain sight. Even among the modest faces of the suggestion was met with raucous laughing, which was understandable given that it was a legend. Since the warrior they described belongs on the battlefield rather than serving, he wouldn't waste his time in a pub like that. The barman at a dilapidated outpost kept working while serving beverages to aliens. As the narrative unfolded around him, his face remained unaltered and his focus remained steady, disappearing into the backdrop. This time, the guards who typically ignored the idle banter listened intently and chuckled at the notion of a human war. The warriors grinned at each other and dismissed the story, considering it funny that any human could arouse such anxiety. They believed that people were weak and frail, and that the idea was really an overblown legend. Of one being a fierce combatant was merely a joke, the barman said quietly. He carried on with his task as usual, his expression blank as though he hadn't heard anything. However, the tale continued to convey the notion that some of the customers they cast seemed to be drawn to warriors who could be hiding in plain sight, waiting for the ideal opportunity. Half jokingly, but with a hint of curiosity, the barman looks around to see if the rumors are true. They had no reason to mistrust him because he remained steady and calm. He was more than he appeared to be. He was still a mystery and an unremarkable person. That he was simple to ignore, and the bartender's demeanor didn't change when the whispers receded. Remained silent and unassuming, but there as if nothing had happened. There seemed to be a depth and serenity in his eyes that indicated he knew the stories better than anyone knew, but nevertheless, as the stories faded into the background, he was just the barman, a human among aliens, listening. As the doors of the outpost pub swung wide and a fresh group entered, a thick quiet descended upon the establishment. All eyes shifted to the stranger entering as the usual commotion faded. The newcomers were bigger, rougher, and carried more weight than the regular customers. They presented themselves as dangerous, and their combination of scars and ferocious gaze made it obvious they were trouble. A frequent customer shrank back, a little suspicious yet intrigued, attempting to assess the scenario since these strangers weren't present. The barman saw right away that it was for a drink or a friendly chat, but didn't. He stopped working and watched them measure the new tension in the room. He cleaned a glass without reacting. The intruders moved steadily and leisurely, scanning the bar with keen eyes, taking in the guards, and other customers' eyes had a sharp edge, and the guards appeared uncomfortable due to an unsaid challenge that hung heavily in the air, but refrained from causing trouble outright with a low, menacing laugh since they were unclear of the newcomer's intentions. Originated from one of the intruders, a huge being with dark scales and bright yellow eyes that strode ahead. His focus was keen as he brushed past tables as if there were no customers. He appeared to assess each person in the room, almost like a predator. Group a tiny alien with jagged dark ridges down its back that is just as fierce. Leaned in close to a quivering customer, displaying rows of pointed teeth in a sneer that made it obvious what regular customers shuffled uneasily, looking at one another in an attempt to avoid the guests. Despite their intention to maintain tranquility, the guards exchanged uncomfortable glances with one another. The guards were cautious since they dealt with a lot of rowdies, but newcomers didn't just appear to be trouble, they were trouble. Extraterrestrial previously, but for the time being, something about these intruders made them pause. Remained back, observing and waiting to see if they were ready to take on the biggest of the stranger. Briefly assessed the barman by turning his head towards him. Then, dismissing him with a sneer, he turned his attention to the guards, point of completely disregarding the barman, as if he were hardly noticeable at all, with his visage as expressionless as ever. The barman carried on with his work without seeming to observe everything, but he didn't react or exhibit any signs of alarm. The group's leader growled softly as he asked his friends, "Where are you?" Then he mumbled so loudly that several close customers could hear him. His companions chuckled in a tone that was filled with impatience and menace, leaving no space for misinterpretation. Subtly making a frightening noise that made the crowd tremble. They weren't only there to make a scene, we were looking for someone. When one of the guards, unable to remain silent, suddenly came forward and asked, "What do you want here?" Demanded, attempting to sound commanding, but his tone faltered a little, betraying the lead intruder scowled at him after examining him with disbelief. With a nonchalant flick of his wrist, he dismissed the guard and said, "Not you." Filled with contempt, they add, "We're searching for a warrior, a human." Were like a challenge looming large over the room, and everyone felt its weight. A murmur went through the audience. The concept of a human warrior sounded ridiculous, almost comical, and people were typically perceived as being weaker and barely able to resist the more powerful aliens who populated the galaxy. However, it was obvious that the intruders accepted what they had heard because they were chasing a legend who was said to be both lethal and elusive. The tension in the room increased. The customers exchanged anxious looks with the guards, fascinated yet terrified, attempted to keep things under control, but they were obviously outclassed, and the newcomers ignored them. The barman stayed in the background, observing everything. He didn't respond visibly, but his eyes were keen. His hands remained concentrated and moved steadily, cleaning and getting ready as though the incursion were nothing more than as a small annoyance. One of the intruders snatched a neighboring chair and loudly slammed it to the ground. Crash, the noise reverberated, and some customers recoiled as the leader leaned in near a "We know he's here somewhere" because of the low, scary voice of the random alien at the bar. Remarked in a menacing tone, so someone had best start speaking out. No one talked as the buddy circled the bar, eyes narrowed and obviously prepared for a fight. However, the anxiety was evident in every part of the room when another guard, this one more courageous or reckless, went forward. Then the others, "You're not welcome here," he stated firmly, yet there was no genuineness in his voice. While the main intruder snorted, obviously unimpressed. "What will you do about it?" Sneering in a contemptuous tone, the guard paused, and then, undoubtedly, the intruder laughed harshly and casually pushed the guard away. The guard stumbled but remained erect, ashamed, but too scared to strike back. The barman kept working, his posture relaxed, his expression calm, but he would flinch or halt, just disappearing into the background as he always did. Maintained a neutral expression while keeping a silent watch on the intruders and following their every move. Intensity, he appeared to be only a bystander, uninvolved and unmoved by the growing threat and the impatient. The intruders began shoving and roughhousing the customers, and shouting loudly, mocking and demanding answers. They were prepared to destroy the premises in order to. Glasses were broken, seats were overturned, and there was a lot of tension in the guards were outnumbered and hesitant to interact with the air. The barman worked in silence, seemingly unaffected by the alien's obvious superior power and ferocity. He wiped down the counter, refilled drinks, and walked past the intruders, but nothing unusual was happening. He seemed to exist on a different dimension, unmoved by the chaos going on around him, without bringing attention to himself. The customers looked at him intermittently, confused and afraid. How he managed to stay so composed when the lead intruder's patience eventually ran out were not leaving without him, because he barked and slammed his fist down on a table, sending a shockwave across the room. His words served as a last warning, a threat that made it clear he was prepared to use force. He looked towards the bar, his eyes narrowing. Nobody dared to speak, but the customers remained put, and the guards all became silent. The barman kept working while waiting, uncertain of what would happen next. His expression was unreadable, his hands calm, and he appeared nearly out of place. He was not touched by the tension in the room increased abruptly, and the lead intruder became agitated by the quiet and let. He gave a low, dangerous growl and looked back at the barman. But after a brief period of inaudible silence, he proceeded with his plans. It's obvious that he saw a peaceful person who appeared completely normal rather than a threat. When he arrived at the bar, he leaned forward and sneered, trying to take the barman by the arm. His motions were hard and strong, and the barman abruptly moved his hand. The intruder's hold was immediately broken by the bartender's precise snapping out before anyone could react. He twisted the intruder's arm and used quick, relentless pressure to bring him down. As the mighty extraterrestrial found himself immobilized, a look of complete incredulity permeated the room with startled quiet. It was quickly over, and for the first time, the bartender's action was so precise, almost clinical, that the customers in the room seemed to hold its breath as the quiet figure revealed that he wasn't as normal as he seemed. The barman took a step back, his eyes serene and somewhat uninterested, as though the whole event had been a slight annoyance. But there was a tiny change in his posture, that his posture had changed from that of a basic worker to one that spoke volumes. But of someone who was totally in control and accustomed to circumstances more riskier than a rowdy club. He didn't acknowledge the steps or look around, just carried on as though nothing had occurred to the other intruders. Looked at each other uneasily, confused by the abrupt shift in their leader's role, and they hadn't anticipated opposition. Particularly not from the one individual they completely ignored. The barman had not spoken or threatened anything. However, his deeds spoke louder than words, and the guards were astonished and retreated, uncertain if they should interfere or allow the barman to maintain calm. Quiet control of everyone was frozen, and one of the intruders refused to be outdone. Hissed and threw their hands forward, preparing to hit the barman, and accelerated. Then anyone could follow, sidestepping the attack with such grace and speed that his opponent was left reeling. He struck the assailant with a single, powerful motion, dropping him without making any noise to the customers. Widened their eyes as another intruder fell. This was no typical bar. Workers' accuracy and competence were so obvious that it was like witnessing a master craftsman at work. The tension changed as each action was meticulously planned and executed with perfect synchronization. Astonishment and shock at this man they'd seen every day, combining unstoppable force, now emerged into the background, and the customers who had previously disregarded him and scoffed at his there was a quiet strength here, and the calm demeanor now felt a rush of respect and fear. It was unavoidable. One by one, the intruders stumbled as they realized they were encountering something unexpected. It was similar to a predator discovering too late that it had selected the incorrect victim. The guards who had observed looked at each other, uncertain if their own power at this time. Despite their strength and arsenal, they realized they were surpassed by this modest man. Controlled his movements with precision and without hesitation, without the need for armor or weapons. Demonstrated that he was no stranger to fighting. Each action described a lifetime spent perfecting his fighting techniques. Another intruder attempted to circle him after they fought and prevailed in locations distant from this pub, trying to surprise him. But the bartender's keen eyes followed every move with a serenity that with an almost uncanny grace. He sidestepped the attack on Erie and delivered a punch that blasted the assailant to the ground, displaying no outward signs of emotion or rage. He fought with such efficiency that there was no space for error. His movements were deadly and precise, and his visage was as unreadable as ever. They had come seeking a legend, and now the intruders were clearly disturbed, their confidence broken. Evident that they had discovered just what they were looking for, and the customers saw their admiration for the Bartender increase with he was no longer merely a silent presence behind the counter with each fallen intruder. He was something far more dangerous than they had anticipated, and the guards, who had before dismissed him, now held a newfound respect while realizing in silence that they were with someone they couldn't comprehend. The intruder's leader, who was having trouble getting back on his feet, glanced up with a furious and incredulous expression. He would have anticipated a simple victory in a display, but this was not how things were meant to proceed. Of power, but instead he encountered a man whose ability made it clear that he was precisely the myth that the whispers had mentioned. Yet the bartender still displayed neither pride nor triumph. Instead, he walked with the same unwavering composure. As if it were just another aspect of his everyday routine, precision easily defeated his opponents. The barman was standing there, unruffled, looking around the room with a silent finality as the last of the intruders collapsed. Was not a moment of celebration or a grand proclamation. He just went back to his position behind the bar, his presence as silent as ever, his visage as composed and impenetrable as ever. Still in shock, the customers and security personnel exchanged disbelieving glances after witnessing something amazing. They would recall that moment for years to come, when the pub was once again peaceful, even if it was a delicate serenity characterized by the realization of this man's true nature. The barman went back to work as if nothing had happened, doing his duties with the ease that he had become accustomed to. There was no trace of conceit or recognition of his actions. He just continued on, refocusing his attention on his duties. Leaving a room filled with astonished spectators, for the customers, the guards, and even the fallen intruders came to this slow but potent realization. They had failed to notice that the silent person who poured their drinks was, in fact, the legendary figure. His reputation hadn't been overstated. On the contrary, it had been subtle, and as he carried on with his task, the quiet remained. Full of wonder and a fresh regard that no one dared disturb. Talk out loud, the barman, who remained composed and calm, was once more merely a figure behind the counter. But now that he was no longer considered normal, the atmosphere was somewhat heavy, with the customers, who had previously been engrossed in their own stories and laughs, now sat in shock at the weight of what had just transpired. Still absorbing the swift, indisputable force they had just seen, they were silent. The bartender's seamless proficiency humbled the guards, who were normally the loudest and most confident, and they avoided looking at him. Some customers looked at each other, not sure whether to acknowledge him or just act as though nothing had occurred. Anxiety and silent wonder as everyone attempted to comprehend the barman, a man they believed they knew, without speaking a word, picked up a glass, cleaned it, put it down, and went back to his routine. Then, as if this were just another day, his motions were as deliberate and leisurely as ever. As before, but customers now seemed to recognize that every activity had a greater significance. With fresh eyes, he no longer views the scars on his hands as arbitrary marks, but rather as a silent testament to a life no one had envisioned. The fallen intruders being transported while still moaning in defeat. With their egos crushed, they turned away from the barman, no longer considering him to be a simple human, but as something far outside of their comprehension, and the guards reluctantly assisted them in leaving without making eye contact. As they moved their expressions, they made contact with the one man in the room who displayed a strength that none of them could match, showed a mix of terror and respect, as well as an implicit admission that they had been mistaken about him all along. The customers, unsure but curious, started whispering the once dismissive myths about the fabled human warrior, suddenly had a face, because of what had happened just before their eyes. Every nuance of his expertise, his accuracy, and his quiet remained in the although he did not reciprocate. A few braver customers than the others nodded their appreciation in his direction. He merely carried on with his task, unfazed and unaltered by their gestures. Getting up the nerve to speak, one of the guards went to the bar and cleared his throat, but he was at a loss. The barman halted, looked at him, and waited for a neutral expression on his face. Revealing nothing, the guard simply moved back after swallowing whatever words he had meant. The barman was overcome by the silent power coming from the man he had previously written off as being just like everyone else. Gave a slight nod in silent thanks before returning to his work, remaining composed as always. Even though the bar's regular rhythm had returned, the ambience had changed, and customers no longer regarded the barman as an unseen presence behind the desk. But those who couldn't be ignored because of their mystery, those who had mocked the legends and rejected them, suddenly found themselves attracted to him. Not because duty, but above all, they observed him with a mix of admiration and fascination as they attempted to make peace with the quiet man carrying the fabled character they had mentioned just hours before, when the last of the intruders were taken out of although the tension persisted. The bar's occupants collectively exhaled with relief, because they knew they would witness something unique that they probably wouldn't see again. Some whispered to one another, wondering where he had originated from, the conflicts he had fought, and the reason he was in this isolated location. However, no one dared to question him directly because the barman had made it apparent by his silence that he wasn't here to tell them stories or pique their interest. He was only here to work. At one point, a young customer who was filled with awe and respect leaned forward. He inquired, his eyes bright with interest, "Are you the warrior they talked about?" The barman met his eyes and held them for a beat longer than normal, but he didn't respond to the barely audible murmur. He just went back to work, leaving the question unanswered. But in a way, his silence was sufficient. It was his response that the bar started to return to its typical rhythm, but there was a silent reminder that he was more than they could comprehend. The atmosphere changed, and although the customers resumed their chats, what they were saying was softer and more subdued. They occasionally looked at the barman, who they saw in a new way, but nobody disrupted his work. They realized, possibly for the first time, that there was a history and a tale in his silence that he decided to conceal, and as the hours went by, their regard for the quiet man behind the counter increased. Discovered that he didn't look for praise or acknowledgement for his power, ability, or composure. Carried with no fanfare or anticipation, he didn't require a crowd, and he need anyone's approval. He was just present because he had consistently provided no more than was requested, providing only what was required. And the customers now comprehend more than ever that his quiet was a decision rather than a void. And over time, as the evening grew darker, the customers started to go, giving the barman one more glance as they went by. Some even offered him a nod in tacit recognition of his prowess. Some remained out of his line of sight, absorbing what they had seen, but they all came away feeling as though they had caught a glimpse of the barman watched them go through something big and deep that was not intended to be fully comprehended. Countenance unaltered, his eyes unwavering, he wiped until the bar was eventually empty. Down the counter, rearranging everything with his customary accuracy, the silence of the deserted bar was nearly. He paused for a time, gazing at the familiar serenity that descended upon him, out at the now empty tables, and then he went back to his work, moving to maintain his focus. Whispers would whisper stories about the silent barman who was much more than he initially thought, as each customer would relate the tale in their own unique way. Information about their own sense of amazement. Knowing that his legend would develop into, he had little interest in the story, but it was something bigger than life that would eventually make its way to other far-off places. Tales. The bar was just his preferred location, a peaceful area in a bustling as the night became darker. He completed his responsibilities in the universe where he could work peacefully. The bar, which had been tense and full of whispers, was suddenly quiet as he put everything in its proper position. For the final time, he didn't feel the desire for recognition or celebrity. He was just a barman, a silent presence in a galaxy that would honor him with a final note in ways he either wanted or needed. Gaze. He moved away from the counter and vanished into the silence, leaving only a narrative and an empty bar that would endure in the memories of all who had witnessed it.